Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, June 30th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the North Carolina Senate race as Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, is now considering running for United States Senate in this upcoming midterm election cycle. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you might remember that back in 2022, there was a lot of conversation around whether or not Lara Trump would run for Senate way back then. In the 2022 cycle, North Carolina had a Senate race up in which Democrats were looking to field a number of candidates, but arguably so were Republicans. And they were desperate at a period of time as the former disgraced Republican Governor Pat McCrory was looking to run in 2022 and was leading originally in many sets of the polls that had been taken early on. He was at 48%, 40%, 45%, and people were looking for a viable alternative, and they looked to the last name Trump and thought that Lara Trump might be that. And when she was under consideration for this potential bid, she was the only one who seemingly could beat Pat McCrory. He had practically universal name ID, he had been elected governor across the state before, had won Republican primaries twice, and arguably was on track to be the Republican nominee for United States Senate. But again, was entirely weak, would have lost the Senate race even with the Republicans eventually winning it with a different nominee in 22, and it was just going to be a very bad result for the GOP, and so they knew they needed somebody else. And so Lara Trump being floated as this name polled quite high in the initial numbers at 32%, 27%, 24% in the first place position in every single poll that had been conducted in a multi-way race. And the same thing happened this time around, especially now that Senator Thom Tillis has announced his retirement from the U.S. Senate. But even before then, Lara Trump had been polling in a pretty good position against Thom Tillis. A data point from Victory Insights taken back in November, right after Donald Trump won North Carolina on the presidential election, we saw that Thom Tillis, as the incumbent, was polling at a mere 11% against Lara Trump amongst likely Republican primary voters, meaning that faced with an alternative, especially a notable one, the Republican Party of North Carolina flocked in droves to Lara Trump, to a point where it was nearly just 1 in 10 voters that were backing their incumbent senator, where nearly 7 in 10 voters were backing the alternative, which is a member of the Trump family. And this lead is not lost on Lara Trump, especially given where they are in terms of fielding candidates on the Republican side. Thom Tillis had initially announced that he was going to be running for re-election, so many of these U.S. representatives and other members of the North Carolina Republican delegation did not announce that they would be challenging him. Yes, there were discussions, and Donald Trump very much would have had a candidate to challenge Thom Tillis, but to the extent that it was going to be a top-tier Republican, it probably wasn't going to happen, at least not to the degree like what we're seeing in the state of Texas. But North Carolina, now with Thom Tillis withdrawn, Lara Trump, who said in 2022 that she didn't want to run for U.S. Senate and instead was going to be endorsing Ted Budd alongside Donald Trump, what we saw was that her decision there was largely guided by what she saw as a commitment to her family. She didn't want to run for Senate. She didn't want to take that much time away from her children, and she wanted to be able to be present in that degree. Now, this time around, we're nearing 4 years later, and the circumstances around everything is different. In 2022, there was a congressman, Ted Budd, who Donald Trump already had in mind to run for Senate. He didn't want to nominate somebody who was going to lose. He didn't want to nominate Pat McCrory, who underperformed Trump in 2016 by a pretty substantive amount. And what he knew was that if Ted Budd got the nomination because of Donald Trump's endorsement, Ted Budd would largely be a loyalist. The thing about Lara Trump this time, Donald Trump doesn't need to find a loyalist in a member of his own family. Lara Trump is going to be absolutely that. And for a while, she had really pushed away the rumors that she would ever run for Senate in North Carolina. She also was floated as a potential choice for Senate in Florida. After Marco Rubio became Secretary of State, Lara Trump was in the shortlist, supposed shortlist. Obviously, these things are not confirmed or denied by the Governor DeSantis office, but Lara Trump had been floated as this top name to represent Florida in the United States Senate, that she would be appointed by Ron DeSantis and run in the general election to face a Democrat and would likely, more likely, have been elected to a 6-year term. Now, she withdrew, again, for similar reasons, decided that it was not in the best interest to be in this position, that she believed that her impact had already been done, all of these things that you typically say. And at this point in time, a month prior, right, what we saw, or right around this time, actually, a few weeks prior, was that Thom Tillis, in December of 2024, launched his re-election bid for 2026. So Lara Trump, withdrawing her bid then seemed to be an indication that she wasn't going to challenge Tillis. She wasn't going to want to be a senator in Florida, where Donald Trump probably could have strong-armed, Ron DeSantis into making this happen. That she was seemingly retiring, or at least stepping back to a degree from being an elected a candidate, and didn't want that speculation on her. Well, now the opportunity seemingly presents itself in one of the best ways possible. A retirement happens that is unexpected, and somebody has to fill the vacancy. Somebody has to decide that they're going to take the shoes and say, I'm going to run as the Republican nominee for Senate in North Carolina. So looking at Lara Trump, looking at the 2026 Senate race, it is very possible that she runs for 2026. It'd be interesting to see. So I think where we're at is that Lara Trump, considering this bid, is the closest she has gotten to really jumping into the race. I think that she will have a conversation with Donald Trump and will make a decision based on that. And largely speaking, if Donald Trump gives her the blessing, this nomination is hers. Now, the general election, very different story. For 2026, Roy Cooper, the former Democratic governor of this state, actually said that his deadline on whether or not he will run will be in the month of June. So it looks like we're going to see that push to July unless we get a surprise announcement. It's 12:36 p.m. Eastern time right now. Maybe he announces later today. The point is that we would have to wait and see because the decision was expected June of 2025. But Democrats are very hopeful that they are going to get Roy Cooper to run for United States Senate, that they are going to get a former Republican or Democratic governor who is very popular across the state, who won his election first in 2016 with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, won his re-election in 2020 with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. The Senate Dems were very excited at the prospect of recruiting Roy Cooper, and it looks like that's going to happen. But we have to wait for an announcement. And what I will say is that Wiley Nickel, who is running as the former U.S. representative from North Carolina's 13th district, is also somebody who I do believe can win the general election. It is just very much that Roy Cooper would win this nomination. Wiley Nickel probably would not run for Senate against him. And what we would probably see is that it would be an easy primary on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat alike. And you will find that Roy Cooper will be the Democratic nominee, should he run, Lara Trump, the Republican nominee. But as I was saying, on the point of the general election, I believe adamantly that Roy Cooper would defeat Lara Trump because Lara Trump does not fit the standard of somebody who can win statewide North Carolina in 2026. If she ran alongside the same ballot as maybe Donald Trump in 2024, I could see a more reasonable conclusion that you might arrive at. But what we know about midterms with an incumbent Republican president, as it is the case always with an incumbent political party, is that you suffer major losses in your first midterm cycle. Now, this is the second time there will be a Donald Trump midterm, and the first time did not go so well for the GOP, really whatsoever. Democrats maintained a number of seats the Republicans had held and won in 2016. Democrats were able to flip the House of Representatives, winning 40 seats away from the GOP. And these massive gains didn't come easily. Democrats very obviously fought hard for it. Democrats obviously went deep into the race and said, we're going to run in 2018. We are the anti-Trump X, Y, and Z this time around. There would not be a better person to run against to be this anti-Trump again than Lara Trump. And while the Democratic strategy absolutely needs a revamp and revitalization from being just the anti-Trump, don't get me wrong, but a midterm electorate is very different than a presidential electorate, and arguably a very different electorate we will see come November of 26, then November of 22, and again, to that point, November of 18. The 2026 midterms, I think, will largely be seen about which new emerging Democratic leader can substantively push back against the Trump administration. And although North Carolina might have voted for Trump by 3 points, I imagine that whoever turns out and votes in the midterm election, if the presidential election had been held the same cycle, Kamala Harris would have won North Carolina, potentially by a point or two. And that's just typically how these things are. That's why you see such massive swings in such short periods of time. In 2008, Democrats saw record-breaking turnout across the country. They got 257 seats in what was one of the largest margins Democrats have seen in terms of their majority in the House of Representatives in a very long time. In 2010, however, Republicans picked up 63 seats, and the map went from a whole lot blue to much more red. But the reason for that largely was because turnout went down 14%. But the turnout was high amongst the Republican base and amongst independents who leaned towards the conservatives and the Republican Party that turned out to vote in 2010. Why? The Democrats were complacent. They were happy with Obama, but you don't typically turn out to vote if you just want to maintain the status quo. At least that's not what we knew to be electoral politics in the past. Turnout was also low, which meant that minority turnout was exceptionally low because prior to the Dobbs decision, high propensity voters almost always favored the GOP. And we saw that in 2010. Then in 2012, Democrats gained 8 seats, brought it back up to 201. Why? Turnout went up 11%. 2014, yet again, Democrats are at their lowest point of the 21st century. Why? Turnout goes down 16 points to the lowest turnout election cycle we had seen of the century. 36.4% turnout. Best believe it benefited the Republican Party. And so remembering that, why things changed so drastically? Well, the 2024 election, which had quite high turnout, will inevitably go down in 2026. Turnout in the midterms will be lower, but the most engaged bases will be Democrats and independents who lean towards liberal ideology and the Democratic Party. And looking at Thom Tillis's retirement, you have to think about this. If Lara Trump tries to position herself as this candidate who's going to be tempered towards Donald Trump, knowing that the election, she's certainly not going to run that type of campaign. It's going to be a loyal campaign to Donald Trump. And I think the Senate Republicans probably feel a lot of PTSD remembering exactly what that brought them in 2022, even in a midterm cycle, might I add. The Republicans should have easily won Nevada, easily won Arizona, easily won Georgia, and easily won Pennsylvania because they had Pennsylvania. And what that would have given the Republicans is the same majority that they hold today. But instead, Democrats had 2 more years of a Senate majority. Democrats had the ability to push forward Senate-side legislation that Republicans could not block if Democrats made their maneuvering correctly. And that was a pain for the GOP because 2022 was largely meant to be this red tsunami. They were going to have these massive gains. They were expecting, Kevin McCarthy said, I expect we win 40 to 50 seats in the House. Do you want to see the House number? Do you want to see what actually happened? Well, if you remember, Democrats were at 222. Then Republicans got to 222. A change of just 10 seats in a midterm cycle where Biden's approval rating on the net was lower than Obama's in 2010 when Obama lost 63 seats. Lower than Obama's in 2014 when the Democrats got 188 seats. Democrats got 213. And on par, in a bad way, with Donald Trump's approval rating in 2018 when Republicans lost 40 seats. A primary reason was Dobbs. But a secondhand reason that played directly into Dobbs, because everything is so intertwined, was because these MAGA nominees had gotten this far. Dobbs was seen as extreme. Democrats turned out a base. And because of the extremism point, they were unwilling to go anything beyond I'm pro-life with no exceptions, or I'm pro-life with one exception or 2 exceptions, and voters didn't like that, especially when it came down to these questions of would you support a national ban on abortion? Republicans couldn't answer it, but you had people like Herschel Walker going full out, guns blazing, I'm pro-life. Blake Masters ran on the same thing. Adam Laxalt ran on the same thing. Dr. Oz, snake oil salesman, right? These are the types of candidates that made it through because of Donald Trump's blessing. And while Donald Trump himself might be this electoral juggernaut who can win elections, it doesn't mean the people around him can too. And it certainly doesn't mean that his daughter-in-law is going to be the next United States Senator from North Carolina. And while the race will inevitably be close, because that is the nature of North Carolina as a swing state, Roy Cooper, if he wants it, will have this Senate race, should Lara Trump be the nominee. Because this is not a presidential election where you can rely on the coattails of your father-in-law. This is not a Republican positive midterm year where you can rely on exceptionally low turnout so only your base is at the ballot box. The circumstances for Lara Trump to be a United States Senator have passed. The environment for it has passed. And somebody has to represent the GOP in North Carolina in 2026, and it's not going to be the incumbent senator. And mark my words, if it is Lara Trump for Senate, the Democrats get a pickup that evening. And North Carolina as a state, the Republicans have held and maintained both Senate seats for quite some time, a decade now, since January. They may lose just one for 6 full years. And so the question for Donald Trump and Lara Trump will be, is it worth running that risk? But there's also a very strong probability the Republicans do not nominate anybody better, and that Lara Trump might be that losing candidate that was always going to lose, but she just is that sacrificial lamb to this point. And maybe she won't, right? A lot happens in American politics. There could be a huge scandal. On the Democratic side, there could be a huge change in enthusiasm. Something could happen. But as of now, the midterms in 2026 very much look like, in North Carolina in specific, based on candidates alone, the Democrats might have finally lucked out for the first time since the 2008 Senate election when Kay Hagan won her race. So watch North Carolina, watch Lara Trump's decisions, a lot of big ones to be made, and I think a lot of it will be pending on the advice of President Donald Trump and what the national GOP thinks is best for North Carolina at large. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2025 6 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.